This past week has finally revealed the vast gulf between reality and the claims of Jacinda Ardern that the beast economic response to the Chinese plague is a strong health response. The PREFU and the GDP figures showed that to be like every other statement made by the Prime Minister, a complete sham. Her health response has produced an economic response worse than the OECD average, worse than neighbouring Australia, and worse than even the United States, which the Prime Minister says we're doing better than. Our economy is in the toilet, and hundreds of thousands of people are now either unemployed or about to become unemployed. And for those people who defend Jacinda Ardern who think that she saved us, I bet you never thought it was you, your job, or your business that were the ones having to make a sacrifice. And to rub in the salt, all those still calling for stringent lockdowns are ones who will never feel the chill economic winds, as they are all invariably in cushy state-funded jobs. The economic headwinds have turned a sure-thing election for Labour into an election that is now harder to pick than a broken nose. We have stark choices now. The status quo, which means high unemployment, massive public debt, and a decade or more of deficits. Or we can flip the switch and elect a government that backs Kiwis to help themselves. This election is shaping up to be the most important in living memory. I'm Cam Slater, and this is Insight Politics. How is the promise of an emissions-free fleet going for the Labour government? Labour promised it would change the government fleet of 15,000 vehicles to be emissions-free by 2025. Not in 2025, but by 2025. We are over a third of the way towards that end date. To be on track for 2025, you could expect around 6,000 vehicles to now be emissions-free, i.e. electric, and out there proving they're better for the environment. There's another argument to be had that the vehicles are in fact not emissions-free, especially when 70% of New Zealand's power generation comes from the coal-fired Huntly Power Station, and fossil fuel power generation makes up 25% of generation capacity. And we also must ignore the substantial manufacturing emissions and environmental damage from mining rare earth metals that make smugmobiles run. But that is by the by. The government promised to make its vehicle fleet emissions-free by 2025. Prudent expenditure would see these, where possible, being managed in even, transparent blocks with signed agreements with suppliers. The government can actually dictate this policy to their procurement managers across the entire government sector. Even if around 4,000 vehicles would be a pretty decent progress, to show you're serious about your election promises. You can always ramp up orders in later years to get to the target. So how many vehicles in the massive government fleet are actually emissions-free? Well, the actual result is 108 vehicles, or just 0.68% of the fleet. You've actually got more chance of catching the Chinese plague than seeing one of the government's emissions-free vehicles. I can sense you're still baffled, so I'll repeat the number, 0.68%. Not 6.8%. In 3 years, these clowns have managed almost nothing, just 36 units per year. At the current rate, it will take over 440 years to achieve the goal that was promised. This is worse than Kiwi Build, which is the gold standard of policy failure. Voters really need to understand that Kiwi Build was not an aberration. It is the norm in terms of delivery versus rhetoric from the COVID queen Jacinda Ardern. If this program was ever going to happen, which vehicle manufacturers have received orders? And for which models, and at what cost to the taxpayer? Where are those vehicles? There was much said about the Crown Limo BMW purchase at the time, but that deal saw the cars purchased at a massive discount to the retail cost and a move away from gas-eating V8 petrol cars into a much smaller diesel engine option, saving the taxpayer plenty in fuel costs. The reality is that this is just more nonsense and sloganeering from a Prime Minister with an achieved delivery rate of less than 1%, like KiwiBuild, like fees free, like rapid rail between Hamilton and Auckland, like flu vaccinations, like masks availability for health workers, like light rail to the airport, slogans over substance, rhetoric over delivery. And to think these smug university-grade politicians think they should campaign on the slogan of "Let's keep moving." Wake up, people. What they really mean is let's keep moving at a snail's pace. For months, the COVID Queen has been telling us that compared to the rest of the world, we've done well at combating the Chinese plague. As you're all properly informed through the pages of this publication, we never went hard nor early. Donald Trump is being lambasted in the US for acting too slowly, yet he moved to close his borders much earlier in February. Our COVID Queen was playing Princess of the Pacific at the same time, gallivanting around spreading hugs and pixie dust to the Pacific Islands. She held off closing the borders so she could have the international media laud her again on the 1-year anniversary of the Aussie scumbag Tarrant slaying 51 people in Christchurch. You could argue that the health response was world class, but you'd be denying simple, easily verified facts. But that's what the COVID Queen has claimed, that we were world beaters, and that's why she wanted the election to be held this past weekend. If it had have been held on Saturday, then you'd be listening to a podcast that outlined how Labour became the first government in history to win a majority under MMP. She really was going to try and keep us locked down so only she could campaign from the podium of truth. That didn't work out, and now the reality of her response is hitting home. You see, she told us that a strong health response was the best economic response. And like almost everything else that she utters, it was a lie, a slogan, dirty spin. The reality is that we are again world beaters when you look at the economic impact, and not in a way that we can feel proud. The pre-election fiscal update, or PREFU, told a sad tale. It shows just how dire the economic situation is. Here are the lowlights. Unemployment is to hit 7.7% next year and remain over 5% until 2027. A massive $32 billion deficit in 2020 and 2021, which is 10.5% of GDP. Net debt is to hit 55% of GDP in 2024 and assumes border restrictions will stay in place throughout all of 2021. The annual growth after recession end downgraded from 3.9% to 2.8%, and a near-permanent deficit with an Obergefell deficit persisting at least until 2033. So that's 13 years of deficits. That's the status quo. An endless deficit, debt over 50% of GDP, and unemployment remaining over 5% for 7 years if we re-elect the Labour government. If we do nothing, that is what is coming at you. You won't care that Jacinda Ardern saved you from the Chinese plague when your business has collapsed, your missus is out of work, the kids can't afford uni fees, the cars have been repossessed, the boat, jet ski and horse float are all on Trade Me with thousands of others, and the batch is on the market too. You know you can't solve your financial problems by running to the bank and borrowing even more on your bloated mortgage. For a start, the banks won't let you. Secondly, it is fiscally irresponsible. Yet that is what Labour wants you to believe is the right thing to do to recover the economy from the impact of their stupid, useless lockdowns. They refuse to acknowledge the damage they have caused. They want a campaign on how well they've done, which is shit. Compared to the rest of the world, Labour has caused more economic harm than most of the OECD. The GDP figures released last week prove that. Stats New Zealand said this about the GDP figures. Gross domestic product fell by 12.2% in the June 2020 quarter, the largest quarterly fall recorded since the current series began in 1987. As the COVID-19 restrictions in place through the quarter impacted economic activity, Stats New Zealand said. The 12.2% fall in quarterly GDP is by far the largest on record in New Zealand, National Accounts Senior Manager Paul Pascoe said. Measures to contain COVID-19 have led to historically large falls in GDP in many parts of the world, with countries' results reflecting the nature and timing of their responses and the structure of their economies. For example, New Zealand's response compares to falls of 7% in Australia, 11.5% in Canada, 7.9% in Japan, 20.4% in the United Kingdom, and 9.1% in the United States. The average fall in the GDP across the OECD was 10.6%. We are world beaters. We scored worse than the average of the entire OECD. Lockdowns have hurt us catastrophically, but the Prime Minister from a podium of truth told us that a tough health response was the best economic response. That was a lie. It clearly isn't true. So do you really think the status quo is going to save us economically? That the party that gave us Kiwi Build failures and light rail failures and child poverty failures and rapid rail to Hamilton failures and emissions-free fleet failures and delivered nothing in the year of delivery and has presided over the worst drop in GDP since records began and has borrowed eye-watering sums even greater than the amounts they criticised John Key for borrowing, has all the answers to all the problems besetting this nation? I don't think so. Past performance is a good indicator of potential future performance, and on that basis, it is time for the circus to end and for the sad clowns to get the bum's rush. We need to vote for a party that is promising better than the status quo. We need to vote for a government that acts like households do in times of fiscal turbulence. And we need to look forwards, not backwards. Which is why National did a volte-face and decided that they would endorse wide tax cuts, because they know that you will act in your own best interests far better and far quicker than any government. They know that wage subsidies weren't your saviour for your business, and they know that for the economy to recover, it needs money in the pockets of those still working. But they know that cutting tax isn't giving you more, it means that they are taking less. Labour and the socialist media always frame this as costing the government money. But that's a lie. It costs nothing to take less from you. And every dollar the government takes has to come from a taxpayer in some form or other. Governments are not prudent spenders of taxpayer funds. Anyone who says they are is lying to you. And the answer to those people is the Green School and Shane Jones re-election fund. So at last we have a choice. You can vote Labour and watch taxes rise. They've already told us they intend to raise taxes. Do you really trust them to only restrict it to the top 2%? It's the only thing they do well. Do you really believe that the Prime Minister won't introduce a capital gains tax if they get a majority? We already know that nothing she says can ever be believed. Even if she committed to no capital gains tax as long as she is Prime Minister, doesn't mean that she wouldn't break that promise because looming fiscal disaster demands new taxes. Or she up and quits after winning the election, letting Andrew Little raise a capital gains tax. I simply don't trust her not to bring it in. Which is why some well-placed Labour advisers are busily running around telling everyone that is precisely what Labour has planned to do if they win a majority. I'm not making this up. That's what they're telling people, and they are very, very well placed and senior. So it's Labour and tax increases and enduring economic catastrophe, or an ACT national government that is proposing sweeping tax cuts. Even if there is a compromise between ACT's position and National's, the bottom line is tax cuts. And of course Labour will claim that the only way to fund tax cuts is to cut spending. Well, duh. There is plenty of spending that can be cut that is wasteful, like the Provincial Growth Fund. There's $3 billion right there. But National and ACT aren't really proposing cuts. They are simply proposing to spend less than Labour. They haven't signalled any cuts to important areas like health, welfare, education and police. None. They are just saying that we will keep spending at current levels and spend less than Labor going forward. That's what you do in your own household. That's what we do to correct the economic disaster that the COVID Queen delivered to us all.
Faces filled with joy and cheer, what a magical time of year. Howdy ho, it's Weasel Stomping Day. Put your Viking helmet on, spread that mayonnaise on the lawn. Don't you know it's Weasel Stomping Day? All the little girls and boys love that wonderful crunching noise.
You'll know what this day's about
when you stomp a weasel's guts right out. So come along and have a laugh. Snap their weaselly spines in half. Grab your boots and stomp your cares away. Hip hip hooray, it's Weasel Stomping Day.
There were no other nominations for this week's Political Weasel of the Week award. Previous winners, Chris Hipkins, David Parker and James Shaw, were unable to match this week's Weasel for sheer audacity in Weasel speak. We've been told by the Prime Minister from the podium of truth that when we travel around New Zealand we are to act like we have the Chinese plague and act like others have it too. Maintain social distancing, in other words. After the second lockdown for Auckland, the government also mandated mask wearing for public transport and implored us to wear masks when out in public. We've seen numerous photos of Jacinda Ardern wearing masks. But it appears it was all for show, because in Palmerston North last week, on Thursday, there she was, an Aucklander travelling about the country, posing for selfies surrounded by others without a mask in sight. For all those COVID Karens traipsing about Auckland wearing masks, checking in and doing your part in the so-called team of 5 million, your efforts are wasted, because the Prime Minister herself, in an Orwellian echo to Animal Farm, thinks that the rules that she forces on everyone else aren't for her. Rules are for thee, not for me, must be her thinking. But what really qualifies her for an NCEA achieved grade in weaseling is the fact that when her hypocrisy was pointed out, she blamed who? Yep, that's right, she blamed the team of 5 million and declared that it is hard socially distancing with crowds of well-wishers. It's our fault, you see. The phone was forced into her hand, you see. Her finger was forced to push the button. Her security was having a tea break. And these people aren't really part of the team of 5 million. They caused it all. It's their fault. And we must believe her because she has declared she never tells a lie. So it isn't her fault. It's these former members of the team of 5 million. It has to be so because she said it was their fault. But is there anything that this ninny will accept responsibility for? We really shouldn't be surprised that she'd blame others. She blamed a cool store for her failures at the border. But that's what happens when Ardern makes a mistake. She blames others. The COVID Queen must be protected at all costs. But my wise old mum once said that if someone claims to be responsible for all the successes in an organisation, then it stands to reason they are responsible for all the failures. A good leader gives credit to others, a bad leader lays blame where it is unwarranted. So this week's Weaselito Political Weasel of the Week award goes to Jacinda Ardern. She joins two-time winner Chris Hipkins, James Shaw and David Parker in the Axis of Weasel.
It's tradition that makes it okay. Hey everyone, it's Weasel Stomping.
We'll have some fun on Weasel Stomping.
Put down your gun, it's Weasel Stomping Day. Hip hip hooray, it's Weasel Stomping Day. Weasel Stomping Day. Hey!
The choices are stark this coming election. You can choose to continue the circus and elect a government with zero progress, a legacy of historic and mounting debt, and no real plans other than tax, borrow and spend some more. They won't get us out of the hole the government dug for itself. It will simply dig the hole deeper. Or you can vote for something other than the status quo. We need sensible economic managers, not spendthrift socialists thinking they know better than you what to do with your money. You cannot legislate the poor into prosperity by legislating the wealthy out of prosperity. Whatever one person receives without working for, another person must work for without receiving. A government cannot give to anybody anything that they haven't already taken from somebody else. You cannot multiply wealth by dividing it. To paraphrase Margaret Thatcher, we need to change New Zealand from a dependent to a self-reliant society, from a give it to me to a do-it-yourself nation, a get up and go instead of a sit back and wait for it New Zealand. And like Thatcher, I believe the person who is prepared to work hardest should get the greatest rewards and keep them after tax. That we should back the workers and not the shirkers. That is not the only permissible but praiseworthy to want to benefit your own family by your own efforts. And the final thoughts come from her as well. There is no such thing as safe socialism. If it's safe, it's not socialism. And if it's socialism, it's not safe. The signposts of socialism point downhill to less freedom, less prosperity, downhill to more muddle, more failure. If we follow them to their destination, they will lead this nation into bankruptcy. I'm Cam Slater, and this was Insight Politics.